Good evening, everyone, to the meeting of the Executive of the 7th of June. Welcome to the meeting. My name is Councillor Paul Follows. I'm Leader of the Council and Chairman of the Executive. Can I start with apologies for absence?
Thank you, Chairman. Apologies for absence have been received from Councillors Marriott, Rivers and Townsend. And
to record that Councillor Mirrlees and Councillor Palmer are on their way. Okay, item 2, minutes of the meeting on the 3rd of May, published on the website. Although, can I just have approval to sign those minutes? Okay, thank you. Declarations, Louise, any declarations of interest received before the meeting?
None received, Chairman.
Thank you. Questions from members of the public?
None received, Chairman.
Thank you. And questions from members?
We've had two questions received, Chairman. One from Councillor Edmonds and one from Councillor Hegan.
Thank you very much. So we've got the first question from Councillor Edmonds. Can I just, who's responding to Councillor Edmonds' question? Councillor Williams.
Thank you. I'll read out the question and respond to it. The question goes, the government policy is carbon neutrality by 2050. Accelerating this programme brings additional cost and the need for explicit deliverable plans. Recent webinars have revealed a difficulty in meeting zero carbon emissions, such as Helsinki by 2040 and China by 2060. Ms. Koskinen, Helsinki's head of the city's climate unit, states that there will have to be a shift away from driving to reach zero emissions. It is not enough that you change your car to electric. This change at national and local level is likely to prove a difficult behavioural change and result in the loss of critical income streams. A progressive start would be to encourage less consumption and to reduce the 100 billion tonnes of stuff produced every year. Using less should also reduce the locality's waste, a strategy being used by Hong Kong. With a carbon at a nominal cost of £50 per tonnes, can WBC deliver value for money? It would be helpful to understand why funding is the critical issue. Please could Councillor Williams advise why he considers Waverley Borough Council can achieve carbon neutrality by 2030, 20 years earlier than the current UK target, and why taxpayers should fund this accelerated local ambition. So I thank Councillor Edmonds for the question and will answer the 3 parts of the question separately, which I take to comprise: why has Waverley Borough Council set an ambition to achieve carbon neutrality by 2030 rather than the current UK target of 2050? Secondly, why should taxpayers fund measures to reduce the ambition to achieve carbon neutrality by 2030? And thirdly, what role do reducing consumption and changing behaviour have in reducing our carbon footprint? So in relation to the first of those questions, why has Waverley Borough Council set an ambition to achieve carbon neutrality by 2030 rather than the UK's target of 2050? The simple answer is that the UK's government's target of carbon neutrality by 2050 is simply not ambitious enough. To avoid climate catastrophe, the world needs to be carbon neutral by 2050. Maintaining a UK target no more ambitious than 2030 passes the burden of holding the world to a 1.5 degrees Celsius rise in global temperatures onto the shoulders of the poorest countries who did the least to cause the problem. In the 1850s, Britain was referred to as the workshop of the world, leading the Industrial Revolution. 170 years on, Britain needs to be in the forefront of the Green Revolution to save our planet. That is a challenge the present government has not taken up, but it is a challenge that many local councils have. 336 out of 409 councils across the UK have declared a climate emergency. That's 82%. 316 out of 409 councils have developed an action plan to take them on this journey. That's 77%. And 211 out of 409 councils have set the ambition of becoming carbon neutral by 2030, and that is 52%. So despite the challenges faced by local government, of which there are many, the majority of councils in the UK have set themselves the ambitious target of becoming carbon neutral by 2030. And of that, Waverley is one. Moving on to the second point, why should taxpayers fund measures to reduce the ambition to achieve carbon neutrality by 2030? The actual financial costs of catastrophic climate change are astonishing and far outweigh the significant costs of mitigating the impact of climate change by carbon reduction strategies. Recent research at University College London suggested that although there is still considerable uncertainty about how much climate change affects long-term growth, the economic costs of warming this century could be up to 51% of global GDP. And the study co-author, Dr. Chris Brierley, said, climate change makes detrimental events like the recent heat wave in North America and the floods in Europe much more likely. If we stop assuming that economies recover from such events within months, the costs of warming look much higher than usually stated. Waverley Borough Council, having set a target of net zero by 2030, recognises the challenge and the costs of this trajectory. Given that funding is being withdrawn from local government by the present government, we are supporting the various cross-party calls on the government to provide funding to councils with robust, fully developed and costed action plans for action on climate change. Councillor Edmonds will be aware that a motion calling on the government to fund Waverley's action plan and that of other councils was passed at the last full council meeting. And I'm sure Councillor Edmonds will also be aware that many of the steps we have taken to date are not costly. They are not even cost neutral. They are actually cost effective on financial grounds alone. Decarbonisation, cutting energy use is now cost effective even by the narrowest definition. And the final element or aspect, if you like, of Councillor Edmonds' question was what role do reducing consumption and changing behaviour have in reducing our carbon footprint? Waverley recognised that reducing consumption and changing behaviour are important in reducing our carbon footprint. It is for this reason that we have supported the Take the Jump initiative, which is about helping people to lead more carbon-friendly lifestyles. We have supported a more rapid implementation of the National Waste Strategy, pushing the burden of responsibility for wasteful packaging onto producers with the producer pays principle. And we are constantly working as a council to encourage the modal shifts in behaviour to a more sustainable lifestyle. For example, through our working with others to develop active transport solutions, pushing for more and better public transport, reducing air travel and building sustainable homes. So in short, funding is critical and we shall continue to explore every avenue to secure funding for promoting carbon reduction and encouraging biodiversity. And we shall maintain our ambitious target of carbon neutrality by 2030, encourage other organisations within our community to do the same, and encourage our government to put itself at the forefront of the global fight against the disastrous effects of global climate change. Thank you, Leader.
Thank you, Councillor Williams. The second set of members' questions is from Councillor Hegan, who's present to read her questions.
Thank you, Leader. The first part of my question is relating to the Chancellor's announcement on the 26th of May, when he said there would be a further £500 million for the Household Support Fund. According to information on gov.uk, the existing fund is 421 million for the period April to September 2022. How much of these funds are available for Waverley residents, and how do they access them? And then the second question is, how many Waverley residents are receiving the guarantee? Actually, a typo in the question. It should say the guarantee and savings elements, respectively, of pension credit. This is new information the government was supposed to be making available in April. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Hegan. I believe Councillor Merriweather is going to respond.
Thank you, Leader, and good evening, Councillor Hegan. So on the first part of your question for the Household Support Fund, the latest announcement by the Chancellor about the Household Support Fund confirms a third tranche of this funding, and £500 million was allocated across the UK in October 2021, another £500 million in April 2022, and now this further £500 million in June. And in passing, I believe the 421 million referenced by Councillor Hegan in her question was just England's share of the initial £500 million tranche. So the government is paying to Surrey County Council the shares of this funding allocated to the whole county, including Waverley, with Surrey then deciding how to allocate the county's shares to us and our fellow districts and boroughs. Waverley received £243,000 from the first tranche, and Waverley's worked with its community organisation partners, including, for example, the Citizens Advice Bureau, the Hygiene Bank, the Godalming Rotary Club, Three Counties Money Advice, and our town and parish councils across the borough to get this money to those that need it most as quickly as possible. The second tranche allocation, which covers the period April to September 2022, have just been finalised with £236,000 allocated to Waverley. This allocation has a greater focus on over 65s, with £173,000 of it being allocated directly to these residents, with the balance for general application to families and individuals under the age of 65. This funding is for residents who are experiencing fuel and food poverty, and once the funds have been received, the application process will be publicised by us, including on our website and through our third sector partners. We understand that Surrey County Council is currently still waiting for the guidance and funding amount for the latest third tranche, which covers the period October 22 to March 23. So that deals with the Household Support Fund. In terms of the pension credit, I'm very much regret that we still haven't received that information from DWP that Councillor Hegan refers to. However, we do have some related data, albeit limited just to residents in receipt of benefits that we administer on the DWP's behalf. And that is that the number of residents in receipt of pension credit, this isn't all recipients of pension credit in the Waverley area, only those claiming housing benefit or council tax support. And this, as at 31st of March, was 1,148, of which 173 residents were receiving pension savings credit and 975 residents were receiving pension guarantee credit. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Merriweather. As is the usual custom, as you've made the effort of coming to join us this evening, Councillor Hegan, if there's any follow-up supplementary questions you'd like to ask, please do go ahead.
No, I await with interest the more details about the 236,000. Obviously good news, but it's, you know, we're halfway through the period, so it'd be good to get on with it.
Don't think you'll find any disagreement here. Okay, then moving on to the item 6, which is leader and portfolio holders updates. I've only got two very short updates, or 2.5, as I know Councillor Williams will certainly be taking up the baton on one of them. First of all, I'd just like to thank the various officers and voluntary organisations who made the Queen's Jubilee weekend such a success. I obviously spent most of my time at the Godalming events, but I know full well that right across Waverley, there were some fantastic events organised by local towns, parishes, often facilitated by Waverley and Surrey officers, particularly with road closures and other associated administration that makes these things happen. The voluntary groups in particular did a fantastic job throughout the weekend, and I think everybody had an absolutely fantastic time. Another short update on Ukraine. Certainly at the moment, Surrey continues to lead the way in terms of taking refugee numbers in. I think only so far behind the county of Kent. Within Surrey, Waverley stands out as being the largest recipient of Ukrainian refugees. And of course, we are still waiting for a number to receive visas through the Home Office, which seems to be one of the principal barriers to actually getting people into the country. And we can only hope that that starts to improve over the next few weeks. And I will very, very briefly mention before handing over to Councillor Clark, but Councillor Williams will elaborate on this, I'm sure, much further. I think we're all pretty dismayed to hear this afternoon that the Secretary of State has allowed the appeal for the Dunsfold fracking application, which of course was refused by Surrey County Council and also opposed by, I think, every level of local government throughout this area by thousands of residents, and certainly by this administration at Waverley Borough Council. And I'm sure Councillor Williams will pick that up in more detail in a moment. And at that point, I will move over to Councillor Clark.
Thank you, Leader. Well, I'm pleased to report for the first time in 2 years, I don't have an update. Everything, the ship is running smoothly. So I'm not going to interfere, but I will donate my time to Councillor Williams, who might need it later on. Thank you.
And in a rare change of order, considering the issue on the agenda, I am going to go to Councillor Williams next.
Thank you, Leader. And there was a lot I was going to say during the update, but I've ditched what I was going to be updating this executive on, because clearly this issue is so significant to the people of Waverley, and particularly, of course, to the people of Dunsfold, but it goes beyond the people of Waverley. It actually impacts on our national energy strategy, and I think that is that is highly the decision is extremely unfortunate. So essentially, Secretary of State Michael Gove has upheld the appeal of UKOG, UK Oil and Gas, to drill for hydrocarbons, fossil fuels in Waverley. Waverley Borough Council has opposed this consistently since we held a consultation exercise, our listening exercise with local residents back in 2019. I'm sorry that the Secretary of State came to this conclusion. However, it is revealing to note that in paragraph 34 of the report, which can now be seen on the website, I quote, "The Secretary of State affords the benefits of the gas exploration appraisal phase great weight above all the other factors that were put in the inquiry and were put to Surrey County Council during that whole process, which led to the appeal, which led to the planning permission being refused." And this, I think, exposes the total bankruptcy of the government, the utter failure to recognise that tackling the climate emergency requires a fundamental and sustained shift to sustainable energy, and that fossil fuels stay in the ground with no new onshore fossil fuel exploitation. For the people of Dunsfold, as indeed is recognised in the report, it means that the effect of the proposal on the landscape character and appearance of the area including the Surrey Hills area of outstanding natural beauty and the AGLV. It means that the effect on the living conditions for residential and commercial activities local to the site, the effect on highway safety, including the suitability of the road network and traffic movements associated with the operation, are ignored. For all those of us concerned about our natural environment and concerned about the planetary crisis, this is deeply disappointing. Back on Saturday, the 8th of January of this year, I stood on the common land at Dunsfold, which could potentially be encroached upon by UCOG vehicles in getting the drilling rig onto the site. And I stood there alongside Paul Follows, our leader of the council, and alongside our local MP, Jeremy Hunt. And on that cold January day, I said, echoing the words of one of those fighting fascism during the siege of Madrid in the Spanish Civil War, no pasarán, they shall not pass. This is environmental vandalism. The battle is not yet over. We shall continue to oppose this environmental vandalism, and we shall continue to oppose any continued drilling for fossil fuels. And this is a deeply, deeply disappointing decision of Secretary of State Michael Gove. But then what does one expect from Secretary of State Michael Gove in view of his past record?
Thank you, Councillor Williams. I just want to also take the opportunity to reassure the people of Dunsfold and the surrounding villages in the east, and to those concerned in Waverley, that we will not just let this go, and we will certainly seek to use every avenue at our legal and political disposal to challenge this as much as we can. Okay, moving then on to Councillor Mirrlees.
Thank you, Leader. Well, I must say, that is so distressing. But at least there's a bit more good news from my end. As we emerge from the pandemic, we are seeing our residents return to using the leisure centres, but as can be seen by the performance report, attendance figures are still some 20% below the pre-pandemic levels. Officers are working closely with our contractors, Places Leisure, to adapt the offering to attract more users back, and we will monitor activity closely. It's very pleasing to see the youth offers, the Friday night projects at Cranley and Farnham restart again, and numbers increasing weekly, particularly at Cranley. No Mow May has now been completed, and we're pleased to say that the feedback has been largely positive, and the changes made to this year's cutting regime has been increased awareness of biodiversity whilst maintaining green spaces for use throughout the month. The return to our normal cutting regime will no doubt be challenging, as grass has grown well throughout May, but we are confident that the new equipment we have organised will deal with this challenge much more effectively this year, and early results are extremely positive. We're also pleased how the tree planning service has merged so effectively with the Green Spaces team. Not only has performance on applications and TPOs improved, the greater resilience of the combined team enabled us to effectively cope with the aftermath of Storm Eunice. And lastly, I'm really pleased to promote Film Waverley, a joint project between Green Spaces and the economic development teams. The project seeks to highlight the suitability of Waverley as a borough to host filming, and in being part of the Creative England database, will encourage companies to employ local people in all aspects of the film business. We are launching Film Waverley at the University of the Creative Arts, who are key partners, on Wednesday, the 29th of June between 5 and 7. This is a free event which will explain the opportunity and how to attract film companies to Waverley. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Councillor Mirrlees. Councillor MacLeod.
Thank you, Leader. I'd like, first of all, to say I very much support what Councillor Williams said about the Secretary of State's decision. I can't say I'm surprised, actually, because you sort of saw this coming with the statements from government ministers about, the cost of living crisis, the increase of cost of energy is allowing them to start to roll back on their commitments to the green agenda. So I don't see this decision as a surprise at all. Seems to very much fit in with the direction of travel we're seeing, and that they've got a very good excuse in relation to the Ukraine war and so on, and that's being used. But it is extremely disappointing, and I certainly admire the commitment and how well Councillor Williams expresses it. Moving on to a brief update on my portfolio, I'd just like to take the opportunity of, first of all, talking about enforcement in terms of, I'm now beginning to get to grips with this area. I've only fairly recently taken it over. And I don't think it's very well understood, in fact, certainly by the general public and even by councillors or even by all members of the executive, the amazing amount of work that goes on in the enforcement area. And in Richard Homewood's area, he's got 5 enforcement teams working on various aspects of enforcement. And the Environment and Health and Food Safety team, we've got 5 officers in it. And last year they dealt with over 2,000 cases relating to enforcement and giving advice to businesses on enforcement type issues. And health and safety, they dealt with 91 workplace accidents, including 1 fatality and 3 major injuries. And they also have to deal with infectious diseases. The Environmental Protection team, we've got 5.2 full-time officers, and they dealt with 3,390 complaints last year. The Licensing team have got 4 officers, and they dealt with something like 1,900 and 1,400 cases that they had to deal with. The Parking Enforcement team, which is actually not Waverley staff, of course, it's contracted out, they issued over 12,000 penalty charge notices, which resulted in obviously helping our car park revenue by doing this, but it also raised over £240,000 in fines. And the Environmental Enforcement team dealt with 755 flight incidents. And even in our own internal reporting, which we had at our executive briefing, the enforcement team stuff tends to be relegated a little bit behind all the positive stuff we do, which is fairly natural because people are much more interested in all the services we provide, the waste services, etc. But there's all this good work going on behind the scenes, and I think we need to find ways of making the general public more aware of this actually in our comms activity. And sort of the same applies in planning enforcement. Again, we've got a team of 5 officers there, and at any one time they're dealing with 250 open cases, and that's something like 60 cases each that are dealing with at any one point of time, and that includes typically 5 or 6 fairly major cases at any one point in time. So I think we need to get this out more than we're currently doing. That's all I wanted to say. I also responsible for Brightwells, but I'll mention something there that's enforcement related. And there was a letter in the Farnham Herald recently complaining about Christ Nicholson creating a great deal of noise to the residents of Faulkner Court, which is one of our senior living residences. And in fact, unfortunately, this letter was written by the resident about 3 or 4 weeks ago. And he wasn't aware, oh sorry, he was aware, but the Herald weren't aware, obviously, when they published this letter, that the incident had already been dealt with. In fact, I've had many people complaining to me about this letter, but our enforcement people have actually been along to speak to Chris Nicholson and ask them to deal with this issue, and they have like 90% dealt with it. So I just thought I'd try to get this out, that there's a lot that happens in the enforcement area that isn't necessarily sufficiently appreciated. And that's all I want to say at this point of time, Leader. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor MacLeod, and finally Councillor Merriweather.
Thank you, Leader. And I'd just like to associate myself with the comments from Councillor Williams and Councillor MacLeod on Dunsfold. That's an extremely unsatisfactory bit of government there. So changing tempo just a little bit, just brace yourself, because Waverley's external auditors have just last week finally completed their audit findings report for the 2021 financial year. And the report is on the Audit Committee's agenda for its June meeting for noting. And the final version of the 2021 accounts is published on Waverley's website. We'll shortly be finalising and publishing our annual report on the financial outturn position for the year 2021-22, including reviews of both the general fund reserves and emerging risks to the medium-term financial plan. In the meantime, though, I can report that both the general fund and the housing revenue account were within budget overall, and indeed with a slightly better position on the forecast outturn reported to members at the end of Q3. I do have an update on the so-called council tax rebate energy grant scheme, which I'll cover later under item 7. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Merriweather. And just before I close this section, I would just like to offer my congratulations to one of the members of this council and one of the members of this executive, Councillor Liz Townsend, who was awarded the British Empire Medal in the Queen's Birthday Honours List over the weekend that's just passed. So my congratulations to her, and I'm sure we all join in that. Okay, item 7, discretionary energy rebate scheme. A rebate scheme indeed. Councillor Merriweather, I'm sure you'd like to introduce this one, and I think we have a speaker as well, so after you.
Very good, thank you, Leader. So before I refer you specifically to the report on pages 13 to 26 of your agenda packs, I'll just briefly provide you with some background. There are 2 threads to this so-called energy council tax rebate scheme, which is an energy grant scheme. And firstly, the main scheme, which I referred to previously in updates, takes the form of a central payment, which we've been tasked with administering locally through the council tax system, in line with criteria set by central government to all properties in the borough in council tax bands A to D. We estimate that this will be of the order of just under £4 million in total. And as of now, or last Friday, all 9,000 eligible households that we do not hold bank details for were written to, requesting their payment details. And as of Friday afternoon, 5,534 of these have responded, and their payments should be in their accounts by the end of Tuesday next week, if indeed they haven't already arrived. We know that not everyone is able to access the IT to enable them to submit these details, and they've been able to provide details via a paper form. But of the 500 or so that we expected to fall into this category, we've already received and processed 236 returns, with 264 expected still to be returned. These will be processed over the next 2 weeks. So in conclusion, just for the main scheme, there were 26,000 eligible households in total in the borough, of which 22,570 have been paid their rebate, representing 87%. So second, now, and turning specifically to the report before you this evening, is the much smaller additional scheme over which we have some discretion, albeit still within parameters set by central government, to support other financially vulnerable energy bill payers not covered under the main scheme. This discretionary scheme is worth £216,600, equivalent to about 5.4% of value of the main scheme. And this report sets out our proposals for the administration of those elements of this scheme over which we do have some discretion. So in fairness to all of those eligible under all of these schemes, we are proposing to preserve the value of the discretionary element payments also at £150. And so the total available will cover up to 1,444 additional properties, additional payments. This benefit is targeted at council taxpayers in properties in council tax bands E to H, who are nevertheless financially vulnerable based on the criteria set out in the report. Our own data is that 780 homes will qualify automatically for the rebate by virtue of their council tax status, other than the banding. And these beneficiaries will receive their payment either by direct debit or will be contacted by letter in much the same way as we've administered the main scheme itself. This means that we'll have capacity for up to 664 further payments of £150 to other eligible homes in band E to H that qualify by meeting other criteria as listed in the report, which are essentially eligibility for other means-tested benefits. However, because we don't have legitimate access to central government data to contact those eligible properties directly, we will be relying both on our own communications and our community partners to reach out to those households that we want to target. We're proposing that these other payments, the ones up to 664 in number, be made on a first come, first served basis. In doing so, we've recognized that not only is the funding for the support very finite, but the need is in many cases really very urgent. So while we realize that there may be a risk that the demand for the 664 payments may exceed supply, we do not believe that this risk is not sufficient to risk instead any delay in payments to one and all. We're also mindful that our existing budget for this year does also include provision for a hardship fund that provides capacity for us still to consider extraordinary cases. I should emphasize also that while our council tax system and data is being used to administer this scheme, none of the scheme elements impact any residents' council tax assessment, account, or liability. Either a direct grant payment is warranted and made based on the criteria, or it's not. Can I close just by saying that this has been an intense and demanding exercise for the team to go through and a significant draw on their capacity. I extend my thanks to the officers for the work and dedication to complete this logistical exercise on top of their usual service delivery priorities. It's important that the team can clear the decks on this scheme as soon as possible to free up the significant capacity currently being diverted to it. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Merriweather. I think we all share in that vote of thanks to the team that have managed to get this through as quickly as they have done. I've got one registered speaker, Councillor Hegan.
Thank you, Leader. And I'd like to echo my thanks to the team. It's a huge amount of work to put upon them. I have a few comments to make. The first is regarding the name. I understand the government forces us to use council tax in the official title of our policy, but could I just put a plea that in all of our communications, we refer to it as the energy rebate scheme. I have first-hand experience of residents who are receiving full council tax reduction, believing that there is nothing in it for them. I've even had one lady say, well, what's the point? I'll still have to give it back to Waverley because they pay my council tax. And I think we should take that evidence of confusion into account in devising the level of the future communications on the scheme. With regard to the criteria, I certainly approve the automatic criteria selected And I'm reassured that that will only erode around half of the discretionary fund. And I think there'll be a high degree of overlap between those who automatically qualifying and those who would otherwise qualify under the additional criteria. So I do understand that there's confidence that we will have funds available to grant the £150, but I am concerned that there's one criteria missing, which will be residents who are energy bill payers, but who are not council taxpayers. And I'm thinking particularly of people who may live in private rented accommodation where the landlord pays the council tax, maybe properties in multiple occupation, and will not have the sort of relationship whereby he or she will share, and that we could therefore have energy bill payers who are not being accommodated in this scheme. And I think there should be some flexibility to reach out to them. With regard to the process, I am still unhappy at the concept of first come, first served, but I take on board also the need for rapid payment. And so I will rest uneasy as opposed to recommending a change on that. But I do think that we want to perhaps have something in the policy to make sure that we really maximise the chance that we don't give anything back. We don't want to do that. And I think that we need to think in terms of having a fallback criteria if we get to September, so that we find ways to spend this money rather than give it back to the government. And there isn't, as far as I can see, a clear requirement for that in the actual policy. And finally, I think we have to learn from the experiences of the first main scheme. I'm probably not aware of all of the pitfalls, but I do know that the letter that went to residents, I feel, was not sufficiently clear as to who qualified if they do receive council tax reduction, and how they proceed if they're not IT savvy. I personally tried to use the QR code and it didn't verify the details I put in. And I think that there is a need to make clear to residents in quite a degree of detail. I don't think it's over patronising to make it really clear how they can get this help. And I think that finally, I do think we should be giving every council tax account that we know qualifies £150 as a credit, even if they haven't applied. And I don't think under the main scheme that's necessarily happening. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Hegan. Just, I mean, from my own experience of dealing with residents on this, I completely share almost all the points that you've raised. Certainly in terms of the letter, I think it's fair to say that it's likely that we're going to have to implement similar schemes again in the future, probably using the council tax system as a medium to do that. I did just want to put our Section 1.5 officer slightly on the spot by asking a couple of questions. One that Councillor Hegan raised regarding those people in sort of shared accommodation, but also one that I'd received from a few residents, just to confirm how the actual banding of properties is actually set. It's my understanding that it's done by the Government Valuation Office, which is a branch of HMRC, an agency of HMRC, and I just, rather than it's not done by the Borough Council. Could you just, if possible, talk about both of those points?
Yes, certainly, Leader. Yes, we as a council do not band properties for council tax. That is done, as you say, by the Valuation Office. On behalf of the government, we have no say in that whatsoever. Now, residents can appeal that, and on the Valuation Office's website, there's a process, but that isn't an appeal process to us. That's an appeal process to the Valuation Office if there is a banding issue. Regarding people who might slip through the net because they pick up fuel bills and don't pay council tax, I will need to just take that point away, check the government's criteria, because it is their money that we're giving out here. And if we've got the flexibility to include that within our scheme, then I think we don't need to make an amendment to what's in front of us now. We'll certainly try and reflect that in how we apply the scheme. And coming back to Councillor Hegan's point about making a credit to a council tax account, we're not allowed to do that. In fact, the point you made, Councillor Hegan, it's got a misleading title that the government have given this scheme, because it isn't to do with council tax. It is a payment of energy rebate, and the government are using local authorities as a payment agent. So we don't actually have the authority to make a credit to someone's council tax account for this. We have to actually make them a payment. And just to remind members that in the February budget, the council have agreed a top up to the council tax hardship fund, which is about people who are struggling to pay their council tax. And in addition, there's also the household support fund. So I think there's a bundle of support measures that are live at the moment, that if somebody came to us and didn't quite fit neatly into one of them, our team here, and obviously with referrals from Citizen Advice, we would try to get help to people as quickly as possible, regardless of which pot it comes out of. So I hope that answers the questions, Leader. Thank you.
Thank you. Any speakers on this item? No. Okay, bear with me. Let me get back to the recommendation. So the recommendation is that the executive approve the discretionary energy rebate scheme set out in this report. Can I have all those in favour, please show. Thank you. And just to reassure you also, Councillor Hegan, on the rare occasions that the government give us any money to do anything, there is a standing order, one that we wouldn't ever need to reinforce with our officers anyway, that we get as much of that money out the door to those who need it as physically possible, and certainly do not hand any back if it can be possibly avoided for any reason whatsoever. Okay, moving then on to item 8, which is the Hackney Carriage Fare Scales review, which I hand over to Councillor Merriweather.
No, it's me.
My apologies, Councillor MacLeod. I can't actually read my own papers. I'm sorry to scare Councillor Merriweather and deny you an opportunity, Councillor MacLeod.
Welcome to take it. It's a very interesting subject. I'll just give a little bit of background to this item, Leader. The council has the responsibility to set Hackney carriage tariffs, which is the official term used, what we all regard as taxi fares within the council area. And interestingly, the last review was carried out in 2014. And one of the recommendations to the executive is we're asked to consider whether or not they should be now done every year as recommended by the Department for Transport. So that's one of the things we have to consider, one of the recommendations. So last done in 2014, what started in 2019 to review taxi fares using what's known as the Guildford methodology. This is a method that's been upheld by the High Court, and all councils tend to now use it. However, there was delays due to COVID, and things didn't happen till this year when we finalised our proposals, and they went out to public consultation between the 1st and 18th of April. 3 comments were received, and they have been reviewed, and we've got recommendations from the officers on the comments received. The other thing that we should say is that the Licensing and Regulatory Committee has approved the suggested taxi fares, but they made a suggestion that the current booking fee of 60p should be increased to £1. The officers don't support this, in fact, because they felt that it makes short journeys rather expensive. And also it's not actually a booking fee isn't actually part of the Guildford methodology in any case. But no one's suggesting that we abolish the booking fee, just that we leave it at the current level of 60p. And at formal discussions at executive briefing, I think most members of the executive felt that they would support the officers in sticking it with the current booking fee of 60p. So there we have it. The new fares have been approved by the Regulatory Committee. They've been considered formally by the executive, and the executive have been happy with them. But the executive would prefer to stick with the 60p booking fee. So we now have to go to the recommendations, Leader. I think it's down to you to take us through the recommendations.
Thank you, Councillor MacLeod. I think we've got no other speakers, so Councillor Clark.
Thank you, Leader. The first thing I'd like to mention is that our Hackney carriages provide a vital transport service in our borough, a service that has become more important as trains and bus services face an uncertain future after any COVID support from central government is removed. It's important that running a Hackney carriage remains financially viable, whilst under the threat of increasing fuel costs, shortage of new vehicles and rising cost of second-hand vehicles. The last review, as Councillor MacLeod said, that resulted in an increase was 2014, and the scheduled review for 2020 was postponed because of COVID. In order to protect the service provided to the public, drivers need to be incentivized to do so by ensuring that the increasing costs of running Hackney carriage are covered and a meaningful wage is also protected. So far, these reviews have been ad hoc and at the request of drivers. But with the uncertainty that inflation brings, I believe that we should now adopt the DFT guidelines and set these reviews to take place every 12 months. Thank you, Leader.
Thank you. And I think the volatility in the economy and just a general view that we shouldn't just make significant corrections every 4 years rather than actually sensibly sitting down and reviewing these annually, I think is an argument that very much chimes with me. Are there any other comments from other members of the executive? Okay, not seeing any, so I'm going to move to the recommendations. The first recommendation, the executive considers the comments, the Licensing and Regulatory Committee recommendation and agree the maximum fare tariff with or without modification. I think it's clear that I'm proposing that we adopt the point that Councillor MacLeod has raised, that the booking fee not be modified as per the in line with the officer's recommendation and going against the recommendation of the Licensing Committee, and it remain at 60 pence. 2.2, the executive's agreed maximum fare tariff comes into effect on the 17th of June 2022, within 2 months of the first specified date. Last date for objections on the scale of fees consultations was 18th of April 2022. And 2.3, the executive consider and decide the future frequency of reviews, which I propose to make every 12 months. If there are no other suggestions, can I have all those in favour of those 3 recommendations, please show. Thank you. Item 9, appointment of executive working groups, which I get to introduce. So we were all treated to the spectacle last night of the latest round of internal squabbling within the government. And it's now pretty clear that they're content to validate a Prime Minister breaking his own laws and condoning behaviour that most of us would consider irresponsible, if not downright reprehensible, and certainly following no code that even councillors would break. So whilst this sideshow has been going on, we've seen massive increases in inflation. We've seen massive increases in the need and use of food banks, and we are observing massive rises in energy prices and potentially food prices too, with the issues going on in Ukraine and elsewhere. This is also impacting the supply of almost every material that you could name. It is also impacting the cost of services provided by government and local government across the board. The government so far have been content to barely react at all. And so far, we've only seen these fairly minimal and potentially quite dubious rebate schemes that local government must implement. And of course, further rebates looking like they're possible to materialise over the course of the next year. Staggeringly, though, some of those, which are, of course, to support the cost of energy, will also allow those with multiple homes to claim as well. I think if we see any cuts to taxes at the national level, I certainly have absolutely no confidence that those tax cuts will meaningfully impact those in the most genuine need. We also must consider the dual impact, not just upon residents, but upon the council and its services. And so, frankly, I think we're at the point where we need to act locally to try and do something about this. So in the light of those current challenges faced by residents and by the council, in respect to the cost of living, I am proposing that we form a new cost of living working group to be established under the executive working group's protocol that we established earlier in the administration. The purpose of this group would be to investigate the cost of living crisis, to inform members and residents upon the aspects and impacts of that crisis, to explore and implement mitigation within our direct remit and lobby those beyond that remit, to coordinate, communicate and expand existing mitigation and maintain oversight of any implementation of any local or national government-led schemes. I haven't got any external registered speakers on this, but does anybody else wish to talk about this subject? Councillor Clark.
Thank you, Leader. Giving an example of how inflation can affect people, the 30-year average of mortgage interest rates stands at 8%. But when I first got married, when I got married, it actually stood at 8%. But within 5 years, it had doubled to 16%. But inflation is not just about mortgage interest rates. Inflation is pervasive and insidious and affects all of us. So at Waverley Borough Council, we will be doing everything in our power to alleviate hardship. Thank you, Leader.
Thank you, Councillor Clark. Any other speakers? Councillor Merriweather.
Thank you, Leader. Yeah, I mean, it's if it wasn't clear enough already, it should be by now that we have a government that appreciates the value of everything, but the value of nothing. And we have, if the intended consequences of their policies weren't bad enough, the unintended consequences are things that the rest of us are having to clear up after them. So I think the concept of a cost of living working group will be important, not only for us to help our residents and support our residents, but hopefully also to feed back to those who are making these decisions that we're having to live with, precisely what the impact of them is on the ground.
Councillor Mirrlees.
I'm really pleased to support this. Invariably, when governments and things happen, you know, events, dear man boy events, as we know, people sort of passively accept it and just deal with it. And I'm really pleased that this council is actually thinking, right, we need to look at it, assess it, and see what we can actually do to help people and help our community. So I'm very, very happy to support this. I know that being the portfolio holder for leisure centres and things, looking at the price and the cost of stuff, which is going up unbelievably. I mean, not just a quarter or a third, but exponentially. I know that this is what is going to be hugely impactful on people and is already showing, you know, already concerning people. So I'm really pleased that we're actually actively doing something and not sitting passively and letting it go on. Thank you for suggesting that.
I don't think any of us here were elected to sit passively. And on that note, Councillor Williams.
No, I don't think we should sit passively, surprising as it may sound. No, I mean, I just would like to welcome this this proposal. We have to act. We have to do what we can after years of inaction by a government that has subjected our people to years of austerity and years of inaction over developing energy efficient homes, which is one of the causes of fuel poverty that people are now facing. You know, it's 2.5 million people each year using food banks in this country. If somebody had said that to me, you know, in those days when we were talking about post-war, post-Second World War prosperity, and the, you know, and the rising standards of living and access to, you know, access to education, access to healthcare, access to public services that people rightfully have, the growth, the development, and the maturity of the welfare state. If somebody had said to me at that point that we'd be in a situation where 2.5 million people are using food banks, I think I would not have been able to believe them. And yet we are in that position, and it is a position which has not just been exacerbated, it has actually been caused by our government's policy. We have to do something to support that. We have to do the best that we can for those people using food banks, using community stores in our Waverley area. We need to be doing something for all those people, even in our relatively affluent area, who are actually suffering the impact of government policies of austerity and fuel poverty. And so I'm very pleased to be supporting this proposal. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Williams. I think it's interesting that sorry, Councillor MacLeod, and I'll sum up at the end.
Thanks, Lee. I can only agree with my colleagues. Surrey is a wealthy county, Waverley is a relatively wealthy borough, and Farnham, where I live, is a fairly wealthy town, but there are some areas of genuine deprivation, even in Farnham and elsewhere in Waverley, certainly elsewhere in Surrey. There's probably a limit to what we can do as a borough council, but nevertheless, we should do all that we can to help, particularly the people in the deprived areas. Thank you, Leader.
Thank you. It's interesting, actually, where you find those pockets of deprivation in Waverley, they're comparable to any deprivation you'll find nationwide, not just relative deprivation. And they often abut towards that are some of the richest in the entire country, let alone within Surrey. Just to also add that this group obviously would bring together, it would bring together specifically 5 of the members of the executive, but of course the meetings will be sent out to all members of the executive who wish to attend, and any that do will obviously be able to take part fully and as they need to. It will bring together officers from lots of different areas of the council to bring some of the strategy together, and it will bring in people from outside bodies that have a meaningful impact in this space too. So specifically the chair of the Waverley Tenants Panel, assistants at Vice Waverley Rep, and any other bodies that the new working group would nominate through its work. Can I also just thank Louise and Robin for helping me bring together the terms of reference for this group. As I'm seeing no more speakers, the recommendation is it is recommended that the executive agree the establishment of a cost of living working group as set out in paragraph 4.1 below, and with the terms of reference attached at Annex 1. Can I see all those in favour, please? Thank you very much, everyone. Item 10, EV charging strategy update. Councillor Williams to introduce.
Thank you, Leader. First of all, I'd like to thank the sustainability team, particularly Delma Bryant, for all the work that has gone into this paper. Sustainable transport has to be a key element of any sustainability strategy, and it's an integral part of our carbon neutrality action plan. I should point out that facilitating a switch to electric vehicles is not the only strand of a sustainable transport strategy. We need to facilitate that shift towards active transport. We need to be doing our best to encourage public transport. We need to be encouraging a dramatic reduction in the volume of private vehicles on our roads, but facilitating a switch from petrol and diesel vehicles to electric vehicles to zero emission vehicles is an important strand of our strategy, particularly in the short term. And we do need to be ahead of the curve, as I think we've said on a number of occasions. Clearly, a major role that Waverley Borough Council has to play is to ensure that lack of availability of electric vehicle charging points is not a barrier as far as possible to the further extension of EV ownership and EV usage in the borough. And all the evidence is that that is the most significant barrier that is faced by people today who are considering the acquisition of electric vehicles. Waverley Borough Council also needs to be encouraging EV ownership as owner of car parks, as a local authority, and as an employer, as a licensing authority, and as a planning authority. The paper is informative. It provides an EV charger rollout action plan. And as I said at the outset, we need to be ahead of the curve. We need to support, foster and encourage the use of electric vehicles in our borough. And I would propose that we acknowledge and support the paper that's before you. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Williams. And I've got one registered speaker, Councillor Seaborn, who's present in the chamber.
Thank you, Leader. Well, just as a starting comment, I have to say it would be so much easier to evaluate updates of documents if red line copies were submitted so that we can see what has changed. However, that's a general point rather than a specific one. So I'll move on to items I have noted in what is in general a good document in as far as it goes. Firstly, if you look at section 6 of the officers covering report, it's stated that external consultation and engagement is being carried out with a variety of bodies, although there is no sign of the update going in front of the relevant overview and scrutiny committee. So my first question is, if this strategy is being consulted on, then why is it being issued now, and not when feedback has been collected and incorporated? The initial version was reviewed as the last item of a long Environment ONS meeting on Zoom in March last year, and comments were made, some of which have not been taken up. This updated version has had no member scrutiny. Secondly, this strategy is in effect a marketing strategy. How do we get high uptake of electric vehicles in Waverley? Well, classic marketing strategy theory requires 4 areas to be addressed: product, place, price, and promotion. In general, the strategy addresses product and place quite well. Sadly, there's just about nothing in the strategy detailing the costs of procuring and installing the different types of charging points and ensuring that the type of charger is appropriate for the selected site. There's nothing about the total order of magnitude costs to Waverley, either directly or through redeployment of grant funding to implement Waverley's aspirations in the strategy. There's no discussion on pricing philosophy for use of EV charging points, such as do we want to subsidise, do we want to provide the points at cost, or do we actually want to make a surplus out of it? And there's no discussion of internal costs for implementation of the strategy. Who's responsible, and do we actually have adequate resources? There's only one pound sign in the whole strategy, which shows how unattuned to the financial reality of implementation this strategy is. And then moving on to promotion of the strategy, I did a word search in the document, and the words marketing, promotion, advertising, and engagement do not appear once. We do set out to engage and inform taxi drivers, so that's a start. But beyond that, the strategy is almost totally lacking in how the strategy will be promoted. So in summary, I'd like to commend the officers for the good work that's been carried out so far, but would suggest to the executive that if the council has any serious intent of making a significant positive impact on the advancement of electric vehicles in the borough, as Councillor Williams has articulated is really important, then more work needs to be done on the financial and promotional aspects of the strategy. The recommendation this evening is to note the document. I would suggest you might want to encourage officers to address the aspects of price and promotion sooner rather than later, so that the council has a rather more complete strategy. Thank you, Leader.
Thank you, Councillor Seaborn. Councillor Williams, would you like to respond to any of those points?
Yes, certainly I'll respond to those points. I thank Councillor Seaborn for his grudging support for the paper and pointing out typographical errors, as seems to be the sort of usual practice, and focus on a kind of obsessive penny pinching approach, which I do discern here. However, I would point out that the status of this report, it is an update report. Engagement with stakeholders is ongoing, and as it made absolutely clear in the paper, the ongoing review of our electric vehicle strategy and the ongoing rollout is actually incorporated in the regular annual updates of the carbon neutrality action plan, which, you know, is subject to overview and scrutiny and is also actually considered and debated at the Climate Emergency Board, of which Councillor Seaborne is a member. In terms of the costing and obviously, you know, the implicit kind of response of Councillor Seaborne is that this is all, you know, this is really all too much. It might cost us a little bit of money here and there to try to do what we can to kind of counter the planetary crisis that we're facing. Well, actually, in terms of this particular item, the cost is fairly minimal so far as Waverley's contribution is concerned. I mean, some of the measures that are taken are fully funded by suppliers, and some are fully funded from Surrey County Council, because we're working in partnership with Surrey County Council on, for example, the on-street electric vehicle. The on-street electric vehicle charging points that we're now seeing coming up over the borough. So I think in terms of the report, I do believe that it's pretty comprehensive. It's a pretty helpful update report in terms of what we are doing. It is in the public arena. We are pretty open about what we are doing in regard to electric vehicle rollout, or the attempt to roll out measures which facilitate the take-up of electric vehicles, and I hope that we will continue to have the full support of the council in that strategy, and I would urge the executive to support this paper as an update, states where we're at. And we will be continuing to update this executive and full council in terms of progress towards our objectives.
And thank you, Councillor Williams. Can I also just again put our 151 officer on the spot? My apologies. I mean, when it comes to the funding and structuring of this sort of strategy, can you just elaborate on where that goes in the budget and how we actually pay for these things?
Yeah, I mean, so Waverley's got, so it depends actually, because specifically on the EV strategy, the funding sometimes comes from the private sector, sometimes we need to subsidise that. I mean, Waverley's got its own carbon reduction fund and action plan, and in the budget we top that up, and that budget is replenished every time we get external funding in. So, for example, we just got some external funding in for the heat pumps at Memorial Hall, and so that had been allowed for in the budget. So that sort of enabled that funding to be available for another purpose. But it does come from Waverley's, so that pot comes from Waverley's council taxpayers. But the EV points often come on a self-financing basis. Very much depends on the arrangement, but it's, you know, quite a well-established arrangement now around the country.
Mark, sorry, Councillor Merriweather.
Yeah, thank you, Leader. For a moment, I was a bit concerned that I was looking at the wrong report. There's a whole paragraph on finance on page 11, starting with the word finance. Now, I accept that it doesn't have any pound signs in it. I suppose if, you know, it depends on how hard you really want to look. But there's a whole paragraph on it acknowledging that there may create additional costs to the council, but that individual projects will be supported by a business case and be submitted for appropriate council approval as opportunities arise. You know, I think for a strategy, that's perfectly adequate at the time being, anyway.
Don't worry, I'm assured reading a local political leaflet that went out in Godalming today that the opposition absolutely do support the concept of EV chargers and will fight for its funding, so I gather. Any other comments?
Sorry,
Yeah,
I would
please.
just like to clarify that obviously when we look at this, we will be looking at the value of the charges, not just financially, but socially and other things. We won't be just looking at the price.
There's nothing I can add to that. Any other speakers? Okay, bear with me while I just go back to the recommendation, as I was naturally drawn to the big paragraph marked finance as well. Recommendation: it is recommended that the executive note the progress made to date on the delivery of the EV charging strategy as outlined, EV strategy as outlined in Annex 1. Subsequent progress updates will be incorporated within the annual carbon neutrality action plan progress reporting. Can I have all those in favour of noting this, I suppose, in this case? Yeah, all good. Thank you. I think the other comment I'll just make to Councillor Seaborn also is that with all of these strategy documents, what they are not is a sort of memorial over the discussion of the subject. They are living documents that considering most of the subjects of these must continue to evolve over time, partly because of the way the financing worked, but partly because the subject matter evolves over time. And I think I just need to remind all members of ONS that you can discuss these matters at any time. You don't have to wait for a version of the strategy to come through. It is actually your right, and I would actually argue your duty, to proactively look at these things, bring the subjects up, bring them to ONS and actually discuss them and add some substantive discussion to the matter. You can't just sit here and complain that you have not had scrutiny. There is a duty on ONS to conduct that scrutiny too. It is a right and responsibility balance for ONS. And time after time, subject after subject, we sit here and hear members have had not enough scrutiny on whatever the subject is. You have a responsibility too. And on that little rant, I will end up going to item 11, exclusion of the press and public, which we do not need to do today. There are no items to be discussed and exempt. So at 19:16, I can close the meeting.